Hello, very beautiful community. I am here to talk with you about ethical questions of various kinds that are coming up as you negotiate this increasingly strange social and political world. So that's all we're going to do today. I need from you, we might again be a smaller group because we're not talking Putin or Ukraine today. From you, I need some clarification about whether you can see and hear me. I am going to do our ritualistic thing, which is to scroll up and honor the people who left questions before we started, because that's a little ritual that we do, isn't it? Isn't it, beautiful community? So let's have a look how we are doing upstairs. Toby, Vlad, I'm interested if you have a view on the works of Dostoevsky. I find his works morally inspiring, particularly the brothers Karamazov, despite not being religious myself. I think they're an important highlight in European literature, so I rank Dostoevsky highly. There is an infinitesimally short video from years ago on the main channel about the Dostoevsky line that if there is no God, everything is permitted, where I share how I think we should interpret that. So I think that's on the main channel. It's a tiny video from 3 or 4 years ago. Jin, what's the most ethical economy and government that would actually work? Is there a live example? So the problem is that we live in a world not just of conflicting interests, but of also conflicting values. Throughout the history of the Western world, there has been a tendency to take up one of two positions. One position says that fundamentally, once you think about it properly, all values are compatible. That's Jean-Jacques Rousseau's position. For Rousseau, if you encounter a conflict between liberty and equality, it's because you haven't understood the two values properly. Once you understand them properly, you'd see they couldn't clash. And then there is a second position that's very common, which says, yes, values clash, but we can prescribe universal methods for adjudicating conflicts of value. So here you might find a sort of Kantian position that says, sure, values conflict, but we can prescribe and ascertain principles of right and justice that allow us to negotiate these conflicts. Or a very simple-minded kind of utilitarian might say, well, these values conflict, but actually I'm going to give you a certain kind of measuring stick, which might be utility or something else, and that'll help you resolve all of these conflicts. And I think my view as a philosopher, very importantly, is that both of these positions are fundamental illusions. That's to say, values don't only conflict, but values are incommensurable. Values get in each other's way, and you get conflicts not just between values like liberty and equality, but conflicts within values. Different conceptions of liberty and equality compete with one another. And there is no theoretical way, and there is no universal way of adjudicating these conflicts. These conflicts can be adjudicated intelligently, rationally, well or badly, but in a particular context. Therefore, the idea of a most ethical economy is, in a certain sense, a conceptual error, because it's going to entail choices, each of which mean loss in terms of value, which can't be then guided by any kind of universal principle. But that's not to say there's not a lot we can say about what an ethical economy in the modern world looks like, and an ethical politics and an ethical government. I will give you just one example. It's very important to me that citizens who are on the wrong end of contingencies that make their lives go wrong need to be supported by the by the state, that the state has a responsibility to address the needs of citizens who are in very difficult positions through no fault of their own. Now, that's a very important principle that nearly everybody shares, in fact, even conservatives. But the question then becomes, how do we interpret that? What do we mean by that? And that's how the conversation would go on. So there are plenty of answers, but what there isn't going to be is some kind of abstract, theoretical, universal answer. You're not going to get that. Dane of the Hill. I experience more and more people drifting to versions of hyper neoliberalism, but might is right. How do you start a conversation that leads people to explore other options? The most important thing to understand here is that most people's ideological commitments, of which this is an example, lie at the level of images more than they do at the level of beliefs. So much of what people are committed to ideologically, they're committed to because certain kinds of images are in their head. And therefore, just challenging them by arguing against them is almost never going to work. So, what's required is intimacy across time. If you don't have intimacy across time with somebody with whom you politically disagree, your chances of convincing them are negligible unless they're a professional philosopher who genuinely wakes up every day and tells herself, himself, well, actually, if a rational argument is made against my position, I'm going to withdraw it, I'm going to change it. So let's see what else we've got. Sloppizar, what do you think of the death penalty? There is no universal argument that you can make against the death penalty that will hold in all cultures, including cultures from the distant past. My personal position in any country that I'm in would in practice be to be against the death penalty. The single biggest argument in the modern world against the death penalty is that it's a contradiction of other things that we're committed to implement the death penalty without 100% certainty that you've got the right person. Um, so for me, the case is extremely strong against the death penalty if you're condemning people who are 99.999% likely to be guilty. So for me, in the modern world, the conversation needs to really start with how we get to 100% certainty of somebody's guilt. Now, if there were 100% certainty of somebody's guilt, I would still be against the death penalty, but then it becomes a much more complex conversation where lots of claims about history and political culture are going to come in. At a political level, just to bring it down to earth, I don't think it's helpful for European countries who don't practice the death penalty to lecture the United States about this. It's not politically expedient. Colin Reed's thoughts on replacing the first past the post system with a proportional representation at the local level to combat political nihilism. All of that's okay, but you need it packaged together with other institutional electoral reforms and a bigger project of civic re-engagement. UK EDC, how do you argue ethically and remain principled when the emerging political leaders and voters attracted to their messages are very often rooted in bad faith arguments? Well, I'd go a bit further than that, and here I agree with Peter Pomerantsev, that it's very important to reflect on how far leaders like Trump aren't actually popular because of the destructive impulses they gleefully liberate in their voters, right? I don't want to say that's the only thing going on there. It might not be the main thing going on there, but it's an element of that. There's an element of people sort of gleefully bathing in the liberation of their destructive impulses. Don't participate in destructive impulses yourself, and don't detether yourself from truth. Never, ever, ever dramatically distort the truth, right? in order to make your point, because even if you win something that way in the short term, you'll lose in the medium term. So a good example might be NAFO, right? NAFO has done a lot of fundraising for Ukraine, um, but at the level of NAFO accounts saying things on Twitter, right? A lot of things they say are very, very false indeed. That doesn't help Ukraine, right? And even if it helps Ukraine today, it's going to stop helping Ukraine a year from now. So when you've got a good cause, don't try to prop it up with misinformation or disinformation. Stasis, the paradox of tolerance. Are paradoxes garbage or are they good heuristics? What do we do about it? Well, the idea is that if a tolerant society tolerates the intolerant too much, it'll become an intolerant society. Practically, the North Star here is actually very simple, in my view, at a practical political level. Is somebody out to break counter-majoritarian institutions like the academy, the courts, parliaments, independent media scrutiny, and so on? If the answer is that they are out to break these institutions, then that's a big, big no-no. However, even when we say this is unacceptable, you can't behave like that, it doesn't follow that we can then go on and treat these people as enemies. 80% of the time today, the balance might change. It's prudent to treat people who treat you as enemies as opponents, because that's probably the most effective way of defeating them at the ballot box. Raymond, how does Europe regain the moral ability to compete in a world of conflict and strife? Again, only via democratic regeneration at home, only by focusing on restoring the trust of European citizens in European polities. Could a society exist where lying is not at all a taboo? And are we heading that way? We are in a place where being seen to be a prolific liar is no longer an impediment to taking up the greatest positions of power. You look at Trump in America, you look at possibly the next UK Prime Minister, Nigel Farage, in the UK, a prolific post truth communicator. Now, could you have a society without a practical use of the concept of truth and truthfulness? No, you couldn't. And all you need to realize that is to reflect on a very primitive society in which you find 8 members. They realize that there is a river a mile away and they need to go fishing there. Well, they send one person to check out the river, and that person comes back to report what they encountered. If that person has caught lots of fish but kept the fish to himself and said, actually, there are no fish in the river, the remaining 7 will start asking questions, right? So it is structurally built into that dynamic that the 7 who stayed are going to ask questions about the veracity of the report about the river of the person who's gone to the river. So what we've done is just put together this merest semblance of collective human coexistence and added to it the merest semblance of the universal materials of human psychology. And then we already got the concept of truth coming alive, right? Immediately, this group will say, is this person telling us the truth or not? And if they're not, how do we either replace them with somebody who is, or how do we guide them to change their behavior? Or indeed, how do we guide all of us to bring it about that we, as a society of 8, are capable of effectively getting somebody to the river and getting some effective communication back from them about what's going on there so that we can eat. Tim Petuchov, is Vlad Vexler a secular guru in a negative sense? Was a question posed on the subreddit Decode the Guru. How would you answer this question? Um, it's my responsibility to encourage my audience to not have an unconstructive relationship with my content. I need to keep getting better at doing that, but at the same time, I can't control that. So a very, very small percentage of the audience will always have an unhealthy sort of parasocial relationship with me, um, in which I have a kind of distorted and excessive hold over them, and in which their picture of me is itself over idealized or distorted. Um, so the question is, do I do enough to keep that to a minimum? Do I do enough to keep my audience free, or do I not? And the answer to that is, well, it's never enough, because you always need to do more. But that is quite a lot I'm doing. And one of the central things that I'm doing is emphasizing, not just intellectually, but physically, right? Even though I'm bedbound and I can't stand, I am very physical on this live. That process matters more to me than the conclusion you arrive at. The easiest way to grow an audience on YouTube is to grow it around a set of propositions. Trump is great, Trump is terrible, Putin is great, Putin is terrible. We do that. But particularly on the chat channel, where we have more of a relational dynamic. On the main channel, I just do produced essay every few weeks, right? But here, process and the idea of return to the same room, the same space, matters a lot. Whether you judge that space to be, excessively conducive to sort of guru perceptions, depends on how good or bad I am at making sure that it's a space that encourages people to be free and encourages people to think for themselves. How do I personally um, think I'm doing? Personally, I think I'm doing amazing. I think I'm doing an amazing job, but I don't think I'm doing as good a job as I should, so I can keep getting better. So um, that's what I would say. Of course, I'm aware of the kind of method I use. I'm particularly demanding and particularly elitist for YouTube content, but I'm also very relational. I spend a lot of time um, uh, relating to idealized versions, in the positive sense of idealized, of how people feel and think about things, and I try to help that move forward constructively. So I would say that that's a great question. Um, this is going to be my answer for today. But beyond today, I think what you do with creators is always make sure that they encourage themselves and their community to keep asking and indeed re asking that question. Okay, I think we've done everything at the bottom. Uh, let's see how we're doing at the top. No, we've done it at the top because we scrolled up, and now we're going to the bottom. Thank you so much, beautiful community, for all the questions that were left in advance. Now, I always complain that something is wrong, and I realize the problem is I can't see. So could we see a resurgence of colonialism as the world starts to look like the 19th century? Less of a question for today. I think broadly what we're speaking about when it comes to international affairs is the reemergence of a world of spheres of influence, which much resembles some of what you indeed did see in the 19th century. Why and when did the majority decide the obvious lies and fake news and dumb conspiracies, general consensus is asking, that they see on social media are true? I never thought people would believe this crap had happened so fast. In a way, that's a rhetorical question. But we are broken down into not just fact, but mental worlds on social media. Can one ethically work in arms development in the modern world? Um, all the things that matter when it comes to that question are going to depend on the details. At what point is it legitimate for the US to treat ICE as criminal terrorists? At the point at which you judge that the government that is orchestrating ICE raids is no longer legitimate. So this is a question about degrees of legitimacy of the government. So clearly, I would say at this stage, the Trump administration is a legitimate government. Clearly, the Lukashenko government in Ukraine is not legitimate. Judging legitimacy is a matter of degree. The paradigm of illegitimacy is if you are in a section of citizenry with which the government, that's your government, is at war. What's the difference between image and belief? You use those concepts often, but I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Well, let's say that I have a commitment to a discriminatory view on the inclusion of women in society, which I don't because I'm a feminist. But imagine that I think that women are capable of being good politicians. But every time I see a female politician, I somehow don't trust her. I somehow think she lacks something. She lacks some kind of gravitas. She lacks some kind of seriousness that a male politician has. What would have gone wrong in my head isn't at the level of beliefs, because if you ask me, do I believe that women are equally able to make decisions, debate properly, fly around, have meetings with other global leaders as men? This prejudicial version of me would say, yes, of course, they can. But every time you give me an example of a woman, I somehow don't rate her enough, even though there's no good reason for that. And the answer here is going to be that certain images are flying around in my head about how women can't quite land decisions, about how there's something a little bit fluffy about women, how women say things they say, but I'm just not convinced that there is a substance that I want behind that. But perhaps no woman I encounter in politics ever really has gravitas for me, not even Maggie Thatcher. What you're going to say about me there is that I am prejudiced at the level of images, but not prejudiced at the level of beliefs. Colleague Miranda Fricker wrote about this in a 2007 book called Epistemic Injustice. Do you think that morality and values arise from group selection and as such can be fit or unfit in a given ecological context? Roughly, that's an unhelpful direction in which to think. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology determines the fact that we live under culture. That itself is a remarkable evolutionary attainment of human beings. But evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology say virtually nothing about what the substance of life under culture is. It's our evolutionary predicament that evolution underdetermines what happens under culture in some very significant ways. And so when you think about life under culture, an essential feature of that is political life under culture, you're never going to either explain it or predict it or tilt it in any particular direction by applying evolutionary theory to it, right? I mean, the most humiliating example I've ever seen on YouTube is the YouTuber and now rather um, wildly algorithmically lost communicator Brett Weinstein, when Brett a few years ago tried to explain the origins of the First World War using evolutionary psychology. Well, it's humiliating, embarrassing, right? I mean, it's like a dentist getting out an industrial drill and thinking they're going to fix teeth with that. So it's very important that what this runs into is a conversation about naturalism, right? It's a conversation about how our political conceptions, how our ethical conceptions relate back to the kind of animal that we are. And it's very important there to celebrate evolutionary explanation, but to not reduce things that aren't explainable in terms of it to evolution. Um, so that's not the best way you want to go to talk about values. Some values are universal. I mean, we've just sort of painted how the value of freedom arises. The value of truth arises, I beg your pardon, by talking about this river example. So some values just arise in virtue of universal features of human psychology, um, combined with the merest sort of elaboration of social coexistence. Other values are very culturally particular. They occur under particular historical conditions. So, for instance, the most dominant value in the modern world, in the modern West, certainly is authenticity. What's it like to be me? What's it like to lead a life that's really authentic to me? And that's just not a value that's there 400 years ago. And no, it certainly did not arise at all because of any kind of evolutionary imperative. It arose because of cultural transformation of the kind that is underdetermined by evolutionary explanation. I see that selfishness sucks theoretically and aesthetically, but I can't bring myself to feel less selfish. Tips are asks. You're never going to make yourself a better person by reading theory or even by reading non-theoretical ethical writing. So here we're in the realm of therapy, we're not in the realm of moral philosophy. Um, I would say that uh, be aware of sort of asking something superhuman of yourself too, however, right? It might be that you don't really need therapy, that you're just reading some theory which makes superhuman requirements of you, which is to sort of care equally, for instance, for every human being in every global disaster across the planet all the time. You can't do that. Spitfire, Vlad, are you totally over your COVID and back to pre-COVID levels of health? Thank you so much for asking. No, I'm not. I'm still dealing with COVID-2 impacts. Um, how is Farage less of a liar than Starmer, Sunak, or Boris Johnson? Um, Farage is not less of a liar than Boris Johnson. But Farage and Boris Johnson both stand out not just for the degree of lies, but for the post truth elements of their lying, saying and not saying something. Whereas there's nothing remotely post truth about Starmer or indeed even Sunak. Sunak is a political entrepreneur, but isn't a post truth politician. So when Boris, during the pandemic, said, wear masks, don't wear masks, wear masks, don't wear masks, intentionally trying to say everything and nothing at the same time. That's post truth communication. So he does that thing that we attribute to Trump, where Trump says, a lot of people are saying that Ricky is a very strong guy, but other people are saying Ricky is very weak. But that's really the weakest, maybe the weakest anybody has ever seen. But he might be a strong guy nevertheless. Nobody knows. Ricky is very strong, a lot of people say, but he might be really weak, right? Farage and Johnson do that Starmer and Sunak don't. Is it ever ethical to circumvent the legal and institutional limits of power imposed by the state? Yeah. Uh, yeah. I mean, if you are Mr. Navalny, Mr. Putin's government does not hold legitimacy for you. Alex, let's check super chats. Alex is asking, Alex, you're going to respond to your email about consulting shortly. Happy to see you. My partner and I discussing Arendt's human condition on a long drive. In your view, how relevant is her work today, and in what ways is it less so? It's extremely relevant today. I generally don't regard Arendt as a great thinker. I think she is an okay thinker. But it's enormously relevant as long as we understand that what we are heading into is not going to look like the 1930s. It's going to be different. So it's very important that the clouds are darker, but something distinctively dark is about to happen, but it won't look like the 30s, and for that matter, won't actually get as bad as things in Europe got in the 30s and 40s. So there's plenty of things that go across both contexts. Today, we've got to be serious about the fact that we're drifting somewhere bad, but it will look somewhat different to the 30s. We're encountering a lot of evil, obviously, and here Arendt's story about the banality of evil is very important. I do think that it's largely true about the majority of people who are compliers and followers. What I don't think is banal is the evil of Netanyahu or Putin, let's say, right? That's for me not banal because it's all about creativity, initiative, a degree of imagination. So the most original and repulsive acts of evil are not banal at all. And here I presumably disagree with Arendt. How can opposition to MAGA, too much mushroom, is asking, be effective when the media and alternate media hold all the advantage? Well, let me try to take that in a sort of ethical way. You post Trump in the most effective way possible. There's all kinds of things you can do because the US political system is enormously complex and it's not going to get asphyxiated by an authoritarian project at every pathway at once. So you try to be effective, but you also realize that you just need to keep doing what you're doing. You shouldn't constantly check, is this working? Is this working? Is this working? Because one of the things that we need over the next 10, 20 years are just citizens who are sane and citizens who are alert and awake to reality and respond to reality with a degree of reasonable ethical balance. So don't think that it's all about just, sort of visible efficiency. It's also about just being positioned in the right way with the right closeness and distance to what's happening. The sustenance of sanity among citizens is going to be actually a very important block that helps keep democracy going. Louis, is coming back and saying, can truth be considered fit then? No, because uh, when we are talking about um, uh, how the value arises, we don't need evolutionary theory to explain that. And when we're talking about how the value is expressed in different cultural circumstances, that's precisely the terrain of social explanation that evolution also underdetermines. So I don't see what value you're going to get except just a conflation, a kind of scientific reductionism that's explanatory and unconstructive. I can't see what benefit you're going to get um, from saying that it's about fitness. Also, of course, it's very important to realize that truth needs to be an intrinsic value, not just an instrumental value. Vlad says, I really enjoyed your joke about setting the conditions for taking a sip of tea. That's in my last video about the ISW report on Russia being at stage zero of its um, evolution of toward a war with NATO, where I didn't poo-poo the concept of a Russian-NATO conflict, but I poo-pooed the silliness of the report. How do I decide who to trust? Use toothpick is asking. What about where the establishment can't agree or is mistaken? What about independent news sources and public intellectuals? The way that I would start this is negatively. Um, Figure out who not to trust, right? So let's say you ask a certain kind of ethical or political question, right? Um, you should be able to judge that if your key moral authority on that question, key epistemic authority is Brett Weinstein, something has already gone very wrong for you. So, because you have failed to recognize how lost Brett himself is. So I would say start negatively, right? What are the most obvious forms of bullshit and deception and misinformation and disinformation? But also start procedurally. Um, don't start, do I agree with this or do I not? But what process does this person go through or this organization go through to get to the particular conclusion they've landed on? What's that like, right? Um, Very often, this will mean you make distinctions within institutions. You take institutions like the New York Times or the BBC, you will often find within them both just children writing something silly in a blog on their website, but you'll also find projects where 12 people led by a top class journalist or two have been researching something, for a year and a half, and they're near world class at giving you a balance of what's true in that particular subject. So I would say you start negatively and you also focus on procedure. Can ethical thinking win? Raymond is asking, in the world of moral brutality and might makes right. So morality, in the sense of ethical claims you might make, um, they don't have any special kind of social power in virtue of being either truer or ethically better. Um, just because you take the ethically adequate position versus somebody who takes an ethically inadequate position doesn't mean that your claim is going to have greater social power than their claim. So, if you like, truth or being more ethically decent is not going to generate you any extra social power. If anything, in repressive societies, being right and being decent is going to be more of a guarantee that you will lose. If you're ethically right, if you're ethically decent and epistemically right, in the way you challenge the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, um, you're going to be taken away in the middle of the night. Um, so it's very important that neither truth nor ethical decency have their own police force. And very often the police force will work against them. Echelon, in terms of determining ethical adequacy in politics, what methods do we apply in practice when waiving unwavering morals against political effectiveness? What you want in politics is for ethics, never for ethical considerations, never to fall by the wayside entirely. But you also don't want them to come to dominate politics entirely, because then large scale politics um, will be impossible. So what you want in an ethically adequate politics, that's why I use ethically adequate as opposed to ethically good or ethically sacred, is a situation where, yes, a lot of nasty things happen, but they're kept to a minimum, and some degree of um, attending occurs to the fact that these are really painful and difficult decisions that are being made. It's a bit like when Barack Obama is alleged to have said that he was good at killing, which he's allegedly said in reference to the drone program and his sort of Tuesday meetings, producing lists of people to be taken out. What Obama meant by that is that he can do something like this and yet sleep well at night afterwards and retain an ethical compass when it comes to other decisions he is making. Um, at the highest level of politics, when you're in charge of a very major country, um, you are going to be necessarily doing things that most decent citizens would never want to do. You can't get out of that. So what you want is a balance of appropriate distance. Politics should not drift too far from ethical considerations and leave them behind altogether, but it also can't be like this. Because if it's like this, the only politics you'll be able to do would be to be on your local council. You won't be able to be a president of the United States um, unless you are ready to engage in devastation of human life, right? It's just impossible. If Bernie Sanders were president of the United States, he would engage in enormous devastation of um, um, uh, human life, uh, just less than, much less than Trump would. So what you want is uh, ethics to be one of the central considerations in politics, but not the only one, and not necessarily always the biggest one. Rachel, is it possible to be an ethical narcissist? No, in the sense that it's not possible to be a narcissist and have integrity. The more narcissistic you are, the less integrity you have, because other people aren't going to be quite real to you. But what you could be is a repulsive and disgusting narcissist who receives narcissistic supply via supporting a good cause in a slimy way. Right? So there are plenty of repulsive entrepreneurial narcissists in the pro-Ukraine space. There's plenty of, narcissists in the pro-climate change space. You cannot. It's not just that you can't have a good cause without narcissists and malignly intentioned people. It's actually that any good cause needs its dose of, um, let's say, folks with mixed motivations, because otherwise you're just not going to get the numbers properly. So I would say that you've got to be sort of realistic about this. I often hear sort of YouTube disputes where somebody calls somebody else a grifter, and I say, well, okay, let's assume that's true. what follows from that. So Ricky is a grifter for climate change action. Okay, so um, what's the alternative? That Ricky should stop being a grifter? Well, he's not going to because he is a grifter. So should Ricky be silenced? Well, that's not a good idea. Um, so what are you saying, right? 30% or 50% or whatever number you pick of people who are visible authorities or visible faces behind good causes are going to be ethically yucky. Um, so here's the bigger, if you like, philosophical takeaway. Um, Virtually nothing great on a collective human scale gets done with purely good motives. But Rachel, if you're saying, could somebody who is a narcissist be a really good ethical person in the sense that you have dinner with them, you tell them about your life, and you wonder, well, are they going to care about what I've said? Are they going to be there for me next week if I need them? At that level, no, they're mutually exclusive. How can we as citizens, Chuck is saying, come to terms with the gap that exists between the ethical world of people in power and the ethical world of the common person? I think one of the strange things that's true today, unfortunately, and it wasn't true when I was going to say not true when I was at university, certainly not true when I was in my undergraduate period. In my postgraduate periods, I think it still wasn't true. Before 2010. No, wasn't true. So, what is true now is that we regularly get leaders elected who are ethically less decent than the average person on the street. We need ethical leaders, allowing for the qualification I made earlier about the role of ethics in politics. But at the moment, we're going downhill. I mean, if you just parachute yourself into any part of the United States and pick the first person off the street, they're going to be far ethically superior to Trump. That's really bad. Same with Nigel Farage. Same with Boris Johnson, the political figures from the UK we mentioned recently, right? Um, Even if I picked three random people just off the street here in East London, all of them would be more ethically decent than Boris Johnson. If I picked 23, could be different, could be different. We could find one or two worse than Boris. Um, but this is a very, very toxic place in which to be, right? That our political representatives aren't even above average. They are way below average in terms of the ethical decency of citizens. That's bad. That's really, really bad. So that's my sociological thought in answer to your question, Chuck. Do good people need to step up, Anon? Yes, good people need to be courageous now. One of the massive illustrations of what a deep need that is what happened with USAID. How people globally affected by the evisceration of USAID, how they were scared and how they were compliant and how they put the tail between their legs and sat quietly. When unlovely authoritarianism comes, you retreat, you succumb to it. It rarely works in the medium term, even if it works in the short term. We need much more boldness. We need to understand that the bad things happening are not aberrations. They won't go away unless we make them go away, and so on. Still waiting for evidence that Kamala Harris is incompetent and what the criteria are for that evidence. D. Rabbit White. Um, well, Kamala Harris is in many respects, hyper competent. For instance, look at the extraordinary evolution in speech making she made during the campaign. She went from being a good speaker in certain contexts and a bad speaker in others to being a very compelling speaker. But she didn't have policy detail, and she didn't have essentially the capacity to transcend the kind of thing that technocratic centrism, I think, is all about. D. Rabbit saying that that wasn't a comment at you. My apologies. Um, we got to the point of having such unethical people in power. How did they get there? Ruin is asking. Via an escalating crisis of trust, whereby increasingly citizens have felt the four emotions I bang on about like a lunatic: um, unsafety, powerlessness. Sorry for this silly stuff on the screen. Betrayal, and then fourth rather, I'm sorry about this. I need to turn something off. I don't know how to do it. Fourth, opacity, the feeling that your political institutions are opaque, that you can't see them. And that goes back to the comment we made earlier. There is actually a destructive impulse in the way people are electing anti-democratic leaders. There's a kind of a liberation of various forms of unconstructive aggression that citizens are facilitated into by, funnily enough, politicians like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. So we got here because there's a real crisis of trust. And the crisis of trust isn't because citizens are irrational. It's because, and broken record again, we've got a bunch of social forces that are causing it, such as the state of social media, extraordinary levels of inequality and economic exclusion, extraordinary levels of unconstructive ideologies of self-realization that make it hard for us to speak in collective terms, um, to do with solidarity and the public good, and various forms of social untethering, right? That people from different parts of society no longer engage in shared space and shared activities together. You can extend that list. So we've got a bunch of social forces, and we've got a bunch of um, emotional states among citizens. David, you're asking a historical question about Gorbachev and Lincoln. Maybe we try it another time. It might not be right for today, and I might not be the right person to answer. Dr. Andy, my question was forgotten. Let's see if we can unforget it. How much morality do you see on the far right spectrum? How sincere are their concerns? Border, abortion, Islamism, anti-woke, and so on. Great question. So very, very low at the level of a lot of the leadership. I mean, I happen to be in the UK. It doesn't matter. It's roughly true for a lot of the others. Very little morality. At the UK level, we did a chat about how an ex-member of the Reform Party, when he was a member of the European Parliament, was charged with taking Russia-related bribes, for instance. So very, very low. The concerns among their voters, however, I do take very seriously. So let's take border. I do think that the concerns of many voters about the border are serious and they're real. So what does that mean? It means that we have to regard these concerns as responsible, whether we share them or not. A responsible concern by a citizen is basically a concern with several conditions. I won't list them all now because I like to add some conditions that I always forget about. But roughly, a responsible position by a citizen is a position that the citizen has thought about quite a bit, um, about which the citizen is being honest, and which the citizen has sustained more than just episodically. So it's not something you think on a Tuesday and think again the next Tuesday. So when a citizen makes a claim like that we regard as responsible, whether we share it or not, it immediately becomes more than just an expression of a desire. It immediately becomes an expression of a claim in virtue of some value. We can debate what value that is, but it is a claim in virtue of some value. That's to say, the value might be security, the value might be democracy, the value might be stability, but the citizen is not just saying, I want. The citizen is saying, I feel a grievance because I am being wronged at the level of some value by the country's immigration policy. In practice, the trouble, of course, is that, and I did do a video on immigration, I think independently on the chat channel, so maybe just search that if you want more from me on it. But I think that roughly, the trouble is that for decades, the West has already had pretty tough immigration policies in some respects that weren't always that human rights friendly. But the reality is that we are now in a place in which Western citizens are simply refusing to accept that any illegal people should come into their country, at least in any significant numbers. And if you've got very significant numbers of people coming by illegal, informal means into the country, that does create a crisis of legitimacy that we need to address. Solutions might not be easy, but you absolutely can't dismiss the concern of voters. You absolutely must not call them, as some of the liberal center does, racist. And you can't call them irrational. You can't call them reactionary. You need to reckon with them. Now, you might feel differently, but then it's between you and them. You're one citizen with one disposition, there another with another. So that's where we are. I think at the moment, not doing enough on immigration risks even worse immigration policies later, because tendentiously Western citizenries have got fed up with the immigration policy as it has stood. Now, some of that is also to do with resentment about the nature of globalization, the nature of globalization as something about which citizens feel they never got a choice. It's part of bigger concerns about the feeling that your country isn't really a country anymore. It's some kind of amorphous mass floating in a kind of a global porridge. I want my country back. I want my borders secure. I want to decide who comes in. I don't want this to be imposed on me and justified by some language of universal human rights. All of these concerns are very valid and very, very significant, very important to address, and they shouldn't just be passed over to responsible post-truth, ex-conservative politics. So, yes. Now, when there is systematic misrepresentation of reality, you have to challenge it, right? When people say X number of immigrants have come in, but they're wrong, challenge that. When people are racist, challenge that. Challenge that. When people are refusing to extend the mayor's generosity toward understanding another group, challenge that. So there we go. That's the beginning of an answer. The trouble with anti-woke is that I'm anti-woke, right? I'm very anti-woke. I think hyper-identity politics has been a calamity for the West. But 95% of anti-woke messaging today isn't anti-woke, it's anti-democratic, and it's anti-liberal, and it's anti-centrist, and so on, and anti-left, and so on, and anti-right, anti-conservative right. So what we've got now is that the anti-woke message has become a kind of tirade against freedom, against institutions, and so on. So we also got to be realistic and call that out, and especially it's my responsibility to call it out as somebody who has been on record as being anti-woke. Although I prefer, if I were to be more accurate, to say non-woke, because anti is something we want less of in our society. Anti this, anti that. Friendship is impoverished by social forces, Monsieur Nothing says, yet I sense less individual ethical engagement with friendship, where it's undervalued. How much can we really do as mere individuals to combat loneliness? Well, I am a huge fan of friendship, and I do think that friendship in our culture is undervalued as a social institution. Um, I mean, there are some friendships that are so extraordinary, right, that they match the depth of other kinds of uh, partnership and marriage and sort of, parent-child commitments. Um, so we don't even have a proper language for it. I mean, imagine that somebody loses their best friend, and it wasn't just their best friend; it was a relationship of a very magical order, right? What happened to some of us, what happened to me in 2011. Now, you come into work the next day. Oh, I lost my best friend. Well, okay, but it wasn't. You didn't lose a mother, a father or a partner. So surely you're all right. Um, so people who write about friendship today, like the philosopher Alexander Nehamas, I greatly value. Friendship is an institution of the most magical order. Um, and yes, with untethering of social bonds, proliferation of various kinds of social inducements to narcissism, friendship is suffering today. But it's not an accident that one of the greatest moral philosophers in one of the greatest moral philosophy books of all time dedicated a large section of that book to friendship, Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. Travis, when is an action unethical? Um, this is always a personal question, unless you point out some kind of utterly caricatural scenario where you obviously have to act, right? Um, so, um, you know, if you're walking down the street and a small child is being attacked by an adult who you could easily physically handle, and you say, you know what, I'm really enjoying this Britney Spears track in my headphones. I don't reckon I'll intervene. That's not good at all, right? That's sociopathic or psychopathic. But fundamentally, it has to be in the less obvious cases a question, the answer to which is built out of the details of the case, right? So if you ask me, is it okay for Ricky in the United States to not participate in politics at all, and even to try to avoid voting? Well, I would say that tendentiously that's not great. But if you then tell me that Ricky is a great painter and needs to focus on that, then it's fine. So it's very important that we shouldn't sort of too abstractly shouldle over ourselves ethically. So the answers to these questions are going to come out with a detailed elaboration of the case and a detailed exploration of what life for that person is all about. David, do you have any advice for a person who is pushing themselves to be more upfront in their relationships, moving away from a more passive aggressive style? I often find I often feel that I'm going too far. Well, that's a personal question, and what I'm going to say is not going to replace any need you might have for therapeutic support with this. But let me say that relationships tendentiously benefit from over communication as opposed to under communication, and that the over communication should take place in moments appropriate to it. It shouldn't just be just sort of vomited out whenever you feel like it. Um, Relationships need space, in which the members of the relationship can reflect on where the relationship is at and explore. So that's what I would say. You're never going to stop yourself from being passive aggressive by just setting yourself rules for what you can or can't say, fundamentally, because that requires deeper psychic change. But rules about what to say and what not to say when can be helpful. That's a quarter of a percent of the answer, but there we go. I have not frozen, I'm reading. Travis is saying, "Look, I really do wonder whether I sometimes fail through inaction, although I do vote." Look, I do think that community engagement is really important. Um, Being in some way involved in your community politics, whatever that means in your particular context, is more important now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But again, you can't just impose that from above on a person independently of what your sense of what their life is all about is. I do think that we have an epidemic of loneliness, by the way, of different kinds of loneliness in our society. Alex was saying that there's a view that politicians have always been scumbags in many quarters. Well, it's not true. I mean, compare, for instance, again, trivially, just taking the UK context, the current leader of the UK Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, and John Major. Just compare these two people at the level of entrepreneurialism, grift, opportunism, and so on. It's like comparing a giant with um, a field mouse. The word I like politically is awake. Rachel is saying that the US is a bit too social for us today, but Rachel is saying the UK is a massive post-colonial entity with many subsequent consequences. There's a lot of that, and I also think class is still very important. Various kinds of class prejudice are very important parts of UK society. Do you think we're failing to uphold moral obligations toward animals um, we share societal and economic bonds with? If so, what moral obligations? What a great question. Um, so, because of the severity of the climate crisis, my attitude to the appalling industrial farming of animals we're engaged in is more driven by climate concern than by animal welfare concern. But there's plenty of animal welfare concern. Um, Important questions arise about whether we are not um, about what kind of predators we are. We're clearly predators, right? We're predators with a moral conscience, but we're also predators. We are predators whose predation is mediated by the particular kind of moral conscience we have. And so when the case is made that we shouldn't kill animals at all um, because we have a moral conscience, that argument with that structure alone is unpersuasive because there's no conflict between being predators and having a moral conscience. Um, that we are that our predations are very complexly mediated by culture, but it doesn't stop them from being predations. That's a good example, right, of something that evolution determines and then something that it underdetermines, the expression of predation under culture, but it determines the predation. Um, then the question would be, are we carnivorous animals or not? We can discuss that too. Um, I do think that there are very strong objections to much of how we treat animals on an industrial scale in particular. However, I am not personally persuaded, either for climate or for animal rights reasons, that humans should stop using animals for food, period. What there is a very strong climate case for and a strong animal welfare case for is for us to be more vegan than we are. I'm not sure there is a case for everybody to be absolutely vegan. Um, so that's the probably where you're primarily driving at. There are a lot of incoherences in these debates, and I've just laid out a couple of the things that we need to get clearer about, but there are of course more. How does tax impact individual liberty? Ben is asking. So if a person who is taxed more feels that it um, impacts their individual liberty, we should be slow to tell them that it doesn't. Remember, in a plural political system, you should be able to tell a citizen, you are losing on this decision, but it doesn't mean that you're stupid or wrong. It's because the decision that we're making contains wrongs on all sides, and so you are being wronged by the decision we're making, and we're sorry that the decision has gone against you. By the way, this pluralistic language is dramatically underused in contemporary politics. I'm sorry, you have a very powerful claim, but the decision has gone against you. What typically happens in modern politics is that people are told the decision has gone against you, and that's because you didn't have a good claim anyway. No, it doesn't work like that. And so, if a citizen feels that they're taxed too much and feels that, having thought about it, has certain bits of fact that they've gathered about it, has thought about it quite a bit, then we can begin to concede to them that maybe it does undermine their freedom. What doesn't follow from that is that they shouldn't be taxed like that. That's a separate question. So, does it undermine their freedom and on balance it's the wrong decision? Or does it undermine their freedom, but it can be justified in terms of other values? Um, I think that the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems we've got with the tax system is um, extreme inequality, especially when it comes to extreme concentrations of wealth at the top. The problem with those, folks on the left would say, is that they are uh, violations of the values of social justice and equality. What I say to get this going is that they're simply incompatible with sustenance of trust. Um, if, when questions are asked about why somebody earns 1,000 times or 10,000 times more than somebody else, and the answers that come back are not so convincing, this dramatically undermines trust and undermines any possibility for sharing in a patriotic way, in the sense of solidarity with all your fellow citizens. So there are real relations between extreme concentrations of wealth and a crisis of trust. Um, Beyond that, the problem we've got is that the major way of solving certain problems that governments need to solve to regain legitimacy, the only way we've found of doing that, that's fundamentally the main way we have of doing this, is through taxation. But tendentiously, citizens, and it's not just a myth, citizens do not like to be taxed more. So we've got a paradox. And it's a paradox to which we don't have good solutions. Yeah, I mean, you don't need to be left wing to think that sort of ludicrous economic inequality uh, undermines, in the same way as immigration finally does, excessive immigration does, the sense that people have that their country is a single thing to which they belong with fellow citizens, right? Um, and one way this expresses itself is that um, people from different economic spheres in society have stopped encountering one another. They don't go to the same places. They don't interact with one another in any context, in the cinema, in the park, elsewhere. And so that creates a situation where you can't persuade people on the wrong end of this inequality to actually share a society with these other people. Yulia or Lulia, thank you. Let's do 10 plus more minutes and focus again on ethical questions, just so that people could thematically listen to this without too many radical jumps of topic. Um, there isn't a magical solution, asynchronicity, to how we strike the balance between individualism and communalism, whatever you mean by communalism, because we go back to all the problems and the challenges that we're facing that we've listed earlier on in our conversation. Max says, thank you. Max, thank you back. Raymond, how do we equalize the need to win this strife between nations and the incompetence of our leaders? You don't. The more incompetent your leaders are, the more you lose, right? Trump's America, um, is capable of doing constructive things on the global stage, but tendentiously it'll be losing. So the worse our democracy is, the worse we will be on the foreign stage. The only way to rebalance this is to focus on democratic regeneration. You're not going to get any improvement in foreign policy until you strengthen your democracies. Can voting rights be reformed to exclude people that actively exhibit sadism? Great question. Roughly, no. Um, One of my heroes who I admire as a great moral philosopher and psychological thinker, and uh, art critic, art writer, Richard Wollheim. Um, Richard died in 2003. Richard thought that it was the responsibility of the government to not pander to the most psychopathological impulses among the citizenry and to encourage the disappearance of such impulses rather than to fuel them the way Trump and Farage do, for instance. Um, it's very difficult to find a situation where I don't share a position of Richard's on something. This might be one of them. For me, that's not a political enough thought. I don't really know what it means to deploy the notion of psychopathology um, in the context of governments making decisions. I can deploy it when I analyze politics as a bystander, but I'm not sure I can ask my government to focus on pathology in its policies. What I think we need instead is some conception of what it means for a citizen to make a reasonable versus an unreasonable claim. And that does need to be conceptualized independently of any psychological categories, except very basic categories like thoughtfulness, decision, steadiness of belief, and so on. I think that explicitly using deep psychological categories in government decision making is something that I think is, to someone like me who wants to keep as much of the political in politics, unrealistic. Is it reasonable to take a firm ethical stance on complex situations I can't deeply understand, get to the bottom of? Complex geopolitical issues or those embedded in cultures I don't understand? No, it isn't. But that shouldn't stop you from the thought that you can understand something about the situation without understanding everything. I would make the case that a thoughtful, fairly informed citizen of Canada or Belgium um, can see that what Putin is doing in Ukraine is not okay, without it being the case that that person needs to understand the nature of the Kremlin regime, the nature of Ukrainian domestic politics, the nature of the Minsk deals. You don't need that. Just like you don't need to understand deeply the history of the formation of the Israeli state, the entire history of Israel to understand that something is very wrong with what Israel has done in Gaza. You don't need to be an expert on Israel's domestic politics or Israel's foreign policy to see that something is very, very shockingly wrong there. So don't underestimate your capacity to know and take a firm stance, but understand that there's a difference between that and being an expert on something. So, for instance, you know, is what we want in Israel, ideally in Israel Palestine, one state solution or a two-state solution? Well, you need to take a view on that of a strong kind, right? Um, Equally, um, you don't need to take a view on future security arrangements in Eastern Europe to point out that it's not great that Putin launches drones at civilian buildings. So um, don't lose confidence in the fact that you can form a view very reasonably, but just distinguish that from complexity. You don't need to be an expert in Chinese politics to know that something is very wrong with the treatment of the Uyghurs. Um, so you can do all of that, but I would recommend you to not take a very strong view on an issue where it's all complexity, where there isn't something simple you can do epistemically. And then you decide whether it's part of your life to deepen your knowledge in a certain dimension. Sometimes you'll feel actually, well, the kind of depth of knowledge I really want is going to be one I can't ascertain anyway in this life. So might as well not try. If you're in a different mood, you might say, well, no, it's good to deepen my understanding of something and so on. So the answer is no, but that absolutely should not undermine your confidence in taking a very firm stance on very basic questions. So, for instance, you might say that what Israel is doing is absolutely appalling, but you don't need a stance on whether it's ethnic cleansing or genocide, that kind of thing. Another footnote here: make sure that your stances aren't a product of your identity. Like if you go into sort of quasi teenage Instagram, you're going to see a lot of 21-year-olds saying, yeah, man, I'm just debating how radical my politics needs to be, man. It's like pretty radical already, but I'm passionate about making my politics as radical as possible, man. You don't need that, right? You don't need to build your identity around your political positions. Your political positions should be, oh my God, these people are being treated appallingly and indecently. I'm not okay with it. Spitfire, I'm doing and I'm being zinged for this by literally almost nobody, but just one or two people a month for not having done my long form piece on Israel Gaza. I, I, the second COVID threw me. I promise we'll get to it soon. Travis, you're asking a great question about uh, millennials helping younger generations with their mental health challenges. We'll get to talking about this more, and I'm also going to talk about the crisis of men in our culture in detail. Josh, changing our diet is a band-aid for the cataclysmic desecration of the environment. So roughly, I believe that um, it's right to get a bit allergic when people mention the climate crisis and then suddenly start off with individual solutions. The solutions need to be um, um, systemic, fundamentally. You're not going to solve the climate crisis by telling somebody to not do X or to do Y more than they're doing, recycle more than they're doing, and so on. And there is a very dangerously unlovely sociology here, namely that it was genuinely a propaganda campaign in the 80s by the fossil fuel industry to make the climate more a matter of personal responsibility. So there's real ideological distortion swimming around in our culture, whereby there's a there's a default tendency to try to start with the personal when it comes to the climate crisis. I think that's wrong. You've got to start with the political, and that's not speculation. Journalists have done a lot um, um, uh, to uncover this distortion of our informational space that the fossil fuel industry engaged in decades back, even including a film called World Against Big Oil that my partner made for PBS and BBC. So this is real. So beautiful community. 1:30. Um, we've got through. I'm very grateful to you for having an ethical chat with me. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of political chats in the coming days. Lots and lots of love and gratitude for being with me. And we're going to talk very, very, very soon. Thank you so much for today.